We are both young, and soon sons will follow." These were the words of Henry VIII after the birth of his daughter Mary. Unfortunately for Catherine of Aragon, Henry would be wrong. After years went by without a male heir, Henry would grow frustrated and seek to escape his marriage. However, for the time being, Henry would continue to treat his daughter Mary like the princess that she was. She had a household of hundreds of servants, her titles reflected her rank, and she was next in line to the throne. But Henry's decision to seek an annulment from Catherine would lead to a series of tragic events that had a profound impact on Mary. It would lead to a life of isolation, bad health, and an identity crisis. As her father's marriage to Catherine was declared invalid, Mary was declared illegitimate in the eyes of the English church and society. This sudden loss of her status as a legitimate princess and heir to the throne was a devastating blow to her sense of identity and security. Driven by his obsession with Anne and his newfound power as the supreme head of the Church of England, Henry required all those in his court to recognize Anne as the legitimate queen. Mary's refusal to renounce her Catholic faith and acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen came at a great cost. She was subjected to emotional and psychological torment, isolated from her mother, banished from court life, and deprived of her rightful place within the royal family. Her education, social interactions, and even her health were affected by this new dynamic. Initially, Henry would be annoyed by Mary's continued disobedience, but when Anne finally gave birth to a child, the future Queen Elizabeth, he would announce that she was his rightful heir and that Mary must stop using the title princess. Since Mary would not acknowledge Anne or Elizabeth as legitimate, Henry would start by reducing her household and eventually dismantling it entirely. He would then require that Mary live with Elizabeth. At this point, Mary was under house arrest. Mary's world had seemingly collapsed. She had no friends besides her mother and a Spanish ambassador. If anyone acknowledged her title or seemed to be friendly, they would be perceived as hostile to Anne. She was not allowed to write or see her mother, and even when she promised Henry that all she cared for was to know of her mother's health and would allow him and Anne to read her letters, Henry would still refuse. Persuaded by Anne that Mary was a nuisance and had to be put under control, he would not see or write to his daughter for years. Things would eventually get better for Mary, but not until her final humiliation. After Anne was accused of adultery and executed, Mary believed that she had a chance to reconcile with her father. But Henry still required her to submit to his supreme authority. It had not been long since her mother had passed, and acknowledging that her mother was never queen would feel like she was abandoning the one person she had loved most. After being given a letter agreeing to all of Henry's demands that just required her signature to sign, Mary would hesitate. This would outrage Thomas Cromwell, who had been ordered by the king to obtain her signature at all costs. Cromwell warned Mary that her actions would endanger the life of her supporters and that if she continued to refuse to sign the letter, he would no longer speak on her behalf. And at last, after years of remaining faithful to her religion, her mother, and what she perceived to be her birthright, Mary surrendered and signed the letter. Finally brought back into Henry's good graces, he would give her a household staff and an allowance, but he never fully trusted her, believing that she no longer loved him. Their relationship would remain distant until Henry finally passed away on January 28, 1547. In his will, he would name his son Edward his successor, but due to the influence of his wife Catherine Parr, he would also bring Mary and Elizabeth back into the line of succession. The subsequent reign of her half-brother Edward VI brought more challenges as England's religious landscape continued to change. Edward's religious reforms had a direct impact on Mary's personal life. Her own religious practices were curtailed and she faced pressure to conform. Instead of a warm friendship, Edward would demand that Mary submit to his rule and act like the subject that she was. Eventually, Edward would pass away from a chest infection, but not before altering the line of succession and removing his sisters from being able to inherit the throne. This action highlights the strained relationship that the children of Henry VIII had. Unfortunately, it wasn't just Mary's relationship with her siblings that seemed loveless, but her marriage as well. Once Mary was crowned as queen, she knew that in order to secure her succession, she would have to find a husband. The obvious requirement was that he was Catholic and of suitable prestige. After debate between an archduke and her cousin, Philip II of Spain, she would ultimately choose the latter. However, her marriage would be marked by challenges and complexities that cast doubt on the depth of their emotional connection. Though the marriage was politically motivated and designed to forge a strong Catholic alliance, it became evident that Philip's affection for Mary was limited. Philip's primary interests in the marriage were strategic and geopolitical. As the ruler of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and vast colonial territories, Philip saw the marriage as an opportunity to extend his influence in England and strengthen the Catholic cause against the rising tide of Protestantism. But for Mary, she was truly in love. She would shower him with gifts and jewelry. Spanish servants would even mock Mary about how quickly she became attached. Being subject to his private thoughts, they knew that he was not physically attracted to her, but needed the marriage to be successful for political reasons. Historical records suggest that Philip's time in England was marked by his frequent absences. He was even given instructions to leave the country 5 to 6 days after his wedding because he was needed elsewhere. This physical distance contributed to the isolation that Mary felt. One moment that would highlight Philip's lack of affection for Mary was her false pregnancy. Mary believed herself to be pregnant shortly after their marriage, and this potential heir would have secured Catholic succession in England, but the pregnancy turned out to be a false one. Philip's response to the situation was telling. Instead of showing genuine concern or empathy, he remained aloof and distant. He continued with his plans to leave England, seemingly unaffected by the emotional turmoil that Mary was experiencing. The false pregnancy underscored the power dynamics within their relationship. Mary's desperation to secure an heir and Philip's seeming indifference revealed a stark contrast in their priorities. While Mary longed for a child to secure the Catholic succession and validate her marriage, Philip's primary focus remained on consolidating his political power and furthering his ambitions on the continent. In the face of these challenges, Mary's longing for love and validation became increasingly apparent. Her dedication to Philip and her desire for his affection were met with a sense of detachment that left her emotionally vulnerable and isolated. And the last time she would ever see Philip, he was on a ship casually waving goodbye, while she watched from a distance with tears streaming down her face. But Mary's struggles would go beyond her marriage. Calais, a strategically important English possession on the French coast, had been held by the English crown for over 2 centuries. In January 1558, Calais was under threat from French forces led by François, Duke of Guise. Despite efforts to defend the town, Calais fell to the French. The event was said to have deeply affected Mary, and it is rumored that upon receiving news of its fall, she remarked, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." The loss of Calais contributed to the overall perception of her reign as a series of disappointments and setbacks. It marked the end of England's territorial presence on the continent and underscored the challenges and complexities of Mary's efforts to restore Catholicism to the kingdom. And ultimately, the last years of Mary's reign would be clouded by the relentless pursuit of religious conformity. The moniker Bloody Mary became an indelible stain on her legacy, as her quest to re-establish Catholicism culminated in the fiery deaths of those who dared dissent. And as her reign waned and her health faltered, Mary's hopes for a lasting Catholic legacy crumbled. The loss of Calais, an emblem of her father's reign, cast a dark shadow over her final days. The realization that her efforts to secure her country's spiritual path had come at the cost of personal and political alienation weighed heavily on her. And so, on November 17th, 1558, Mary's life drew to a close. The tragedy of her life, a tale of longing, isolation, and unfulfilled dreams, was thus etched into history.